imagine you're looking at a chart, right? A chart that tracks a nation's wealth over, well, roughly 60 years.
Yeah, classic composite dual-axis line graph.
Exactly. And on the left axis, you have wealth.
So specifically, we're talking about GDP per capita. And the line starts way back in 1963, sitting down near the very bottom at roughly $240.
Which is quite low.
Right. And for a while, it just kind of creeps along, but then it hits this inflection point and just absolutely rockets upward. I mean, it multiplies more than tenfold, climbing to these incredible towering highs by the 2020s.
Visually, it just looks like a steep mountain peak.
Yeah, exactly. But then right next to it, on the exact same graph, is the right axis. And this one tracks political rights and civil liberties.
And this is where it gets interesting.
Yeah, because for 6 entire decades, this line, it doesn't climb. It doesn't even, like, arc a little bit. It is just a flat, stagnant, completely horizontal line dragging along the bottom of the chart.
Wealth goes vertical. Rights stay horizontal. And smack in the middle of these two diverging lines, the researchers who compiled all this data have drawn a giant, bright red question mark.
It's a really striking visualization of a developmental paradox, honestly.
Yeah, it really is. Because according to, traditional modernization theory, that chart shouldn't even exist.
Right, exactly. The prevailing academic assumption for, gosh, the last half century has been that economic development inevitably acts as a catalyst for democratization.
Right, like they go hand in hand.
Yeah. The theory suggests that as a country gets richer, its citizens become better educated, middle class forms, and then that middle class inevitably demands better institutions.
Like the rule of law and social freedoms and all that.
Precisely. The two lines on that chart are supposed to move together.
But they didn't. I mean, they completely decoupled. And that giant red question mark is exactly what we are going to explore in today's deep dive.
It's a massive topic.
It is. And, you are listening to this because you don't just want to know what happened in global development over the last century. You want to understand the underlying mechanics of why it happened.
The deeper context.
Exactly. So we were looking at an absolutely massive 60-year longitudinal academic report. It's based on a deeply detailed data set labeled mp3algeria.csv.
It's a huge file.
Massive. It tracks over 1,000 distinct indicators for Algeria, starting right from its independence in 1963, navigating through massive global shifts all the way to projections for 2024 and 2025.
And I think it's crucial to understand the framing of this data set right from the outset.
Yeah, please.
Because this report is an objective, multidimensional analysis of a very specific phenomenon. It's looking at the fracture between material modernization and institutional modernization in a resource-dependent state.
Right.
So, we aren't here to evaluate the morality of a specific government or, endorse any ideology.
Definitely not.
We are strictly following the data to understand the anatomy of a nation that achieved explosive, undeniable material wealth, yet somehow maintained an almost perfectly rigid, stagnant political and institutional structure.
Which is wild to think about.
Yeah.
So we have to figure out how a state pulls off that balancing act for 60 years. Is this like a miracle of rapid managed development, or is it the ultimate textbook example of the resource curse?
That is the big question.
Right. And to answer that, the sources tell us we can't start by looking at government buildings or oil rigs. We actually have to start by looking at human beings, at the human body, really.
Yes. Because the very first thing this newly independent state achieved, and it is arguably their most undeniable success, is what the researchers actually call a biological victory.
A biological victory. That's such a striking phrase.
It's the perfect place to start, really. Before we analyze how a society is governed or how it generates its wealth, we really have to look at the sheer preservation and extension of human life within its borders.
Yeah. And I am looking at the life expectancy metrics in the 1960s right now, and it's jarring.
Very low.
Yeah, in 1964, right after independence, the average life expectancy was just 47 years. 47.
It's hard to even conceptualize now.
I mean, to put that in perspective, if you and I were living in that statistical reality, our lives would effectively be in their twilight right now.
Right.
But then you track the data over the ensuing decades, and by the 2020s, life expectancy has soared to over 77 years.
A massive jump.
They added 30 full years to the average lifespan. And right alongside that upward curve, the infant mortality rate chart does the exact opposite. It just falls off a cliff.
It's a profound transformation. And when we look at state building data globally, we see a consistent pattern here.
What's that?
Well, the dividends of sudden material modernization, they invariably appear first in public health.
No.
When a newly independent state, especially one that soon discovers massive natural resources, begins to centralize its wealth, the fastest, most universally popular, and frankly, the easiest way to spend that money is on basic health infrastructure.
You mean things like water treatment plants and vaccines?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You build clean water grids to eradicate waterborne diseases. You establish basic rural clinics. You roll out mass vaccination programs.
Because those are logistical problems,
Yeah.
right? Not necessarily political ones.
Right. They're logistical hurdles, not deeply complex institutional reforms. You don't need a perfectly transparent democratic government to lay a water pipe or administer a polio vaccine.
That makes total sense.
The state, despite the severe limitations in its governance that we will dissect later, undeniably secured the most foundational human right for its citizens, the right to basic physical survival.
Okay, but I want to pause on the social impact of that for a second.
Yeah.
Because adding 30 years to a human life isn't just a win for a spreadsheet. It completely rewrites the fabric of a society.
Yeah, absolutely.
Think about what a life expectancy of 47 actually means on the ground. It means a high infant mortality rate is pulling the average way down, which means parents are accustomed to bearing their children.
Yes.
It means generational turnover is rapid. You don't have a massive population of elders passing down oral histories or helping raise grandchildren because people simply aren't living long enough.
The whole structure of the family is different.
Exactly. But suddenly, within a single generation, that all changes.
The fundamental rhythm of life shifts. You transition from a society where death is an ever-present early visitor to one where long-term planning becomes psychologically viable.
Right. People begin to expect multi-generational households.
Yeah, the concept of retirement suddenly exists. But, and this is a big but while this biological victory is a monumental human achievement, it immediately triggers a relentless mathematical reality for the state.
The population boom.
Yes.
Because if people stop dying early, but keep having kids at the same rate, the numbers are going to compound fast.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And the data point here in the report is just staggering.
The total population multiplied fourfold. It grew from just over 1 million at independence in 1963 to over 46 million by 2024.
It's explosive growth.
And it wasn't just that there were more people existing in the abstract. It was where they were physically moving.
The urbanization factor.
Yeah, the data shows a massive, unmistakable shift from a heavily rural agrarian society to a thoroughly urbanized one. I'm looking at the area chart tracking urbanization, and there's a brutally steep slope right through the 1990s.
This is the spatial dynamic of rapid modernization. As basic agricultural efficiency improves and as the new state centralizes its investments in the cities, the rural population naturally migrates.
Looking for work.
Right, moving toward the urban centers, seeking jobs, better healthcare, and education. And this demographic explosion, it acts as a massive population dividend in theory.
Like a good thing.
Yeah, you have a vast, young, energetic workforce flooding into your cities. In a traditional modernization model, this is the raw human capital that fuels the Industrial Revolution.
Okay, but wait. Let's think about the sheer logistics of that from the government's perspective.
It's daunting.
If you build a city designed to hold 1 million people, but suddenly 4 million people are living there, and all of them are going to live 30 years longer than you originally planned, the plumbing is going to burst.
Quite literally, yes.
How does any state keep up with that? This doesn't look like a neat economic dividend. It looks like a ticking time bomb for public services.
Your intuition is spot on. It is a logistical nightmare. Because while rapid urbanization provides concentrated labor, it simultaneously buries the state under immense, relentless pressure.
Yeah.
Imagine being a central planner in this government. Year after year, you have hundreds of thousands of new citizens appearing in the capital and the major coastal cities.
You have to put them somewhere.
You suddenly have to provide new housing blocks, expand the water grid, build new power stations, lay miles of sanitation pipes, and staff thousands of new schools and hospitals.
It's overwhelming.
And you have to do it at a pace that is almost impossible to maintain organically.
So the state is essentially in a permanent, exhausting race against its own demographic success.
Exactly. The biological victory created an infrastructural deficit to prevent mass homelessness, disease outbreaks in overcrowded slums, and ultimate social collapse. The state needed to build on a scale that defies comprehension.
Which brings us to the most obvious question, right? How do they pay for it?
Have the money.
Yeah. To support this exploding urbanizing population, the state needed immense wealth. They needed hard currency to buy the concrete, lay the pipes, and pay the teachers.
Yes.
Where did this tenfold increase in GDP come from? Because when I look at the economic breakdown in the data set, I don't see a booming domestic auto industry. I don't see a massive tech sector or a thriving export market for manufactured goods.
You don't see them because they essentially don't exist. The wealth didn't come from an industrial revolution. It came from beneath the sand.
Oil.
Yes, hydrocarbons, specifically massive reserves of oil and natural gas.
Okay, let's look at the GDP chart again, but really closely this time. It is not a smooth, triumphant line climbing upward. It looks like the EKG of a patient in cardiac arrest.
It's incredibly volatile.
There are these wild, dramatic, violent fluctuations. And if you know your history, you can literally trace global geopolitical events on this single line.
Oh, absolutely.
There's a massive vertical spike right around the 1973 oil crisis when OPEC embargoes sent global prices soaring. Then there's a devastating crash in the mid-1980s, then another huge mountain of wealth in the 2000s during the global commodities boom.
What you were looking at is the defining characteristic of a rentier state. This data set illustrates the concept of oil rents more clearly than almost any textbook I've ever seen.
This is a textbook rentier state. Okay, break down exactly how that functions in this context, because the economy clearly isn't built on domestic manufacturing or tech innovation.
Right.
It's entirely reliant on extracting and selling pre-existing hydrocarbons.
Right. So in a traditional productive economy, wealth is generated by the citizenry. People invent things, manufacture goods, provide services, and trade.
The normal way we think of an economy.
Exactly. The state then taxes that broad base of economic activity and uses the tax revenue to fund the government.
Right.
So the state relies on the people for its survival, which inherently creates the dynamic where the people can demand accountability and representation.
Right, the classic no taxation without representation model.
Precisely. But a rentier state flips that entire dynamic upside down. In Algeria's case, the state itself controls the oil and gas fields. It extracts the resources, sells them on the global market to foreign buyers, and deposits the cash directly into the state treasury.
So it bypasses the citizens entirely.
The state doesn't need to tax its citizens to survive. It is independently wealthy.
So instead of the state relying on the citizens become entirely reliant on the state.
Exactly. The GDP is fundamentally hijacked by oil. When you look at those massive...
Wait, let me make sure I understand the exact mechanism here. How does a drop in the global price of oil instantly translate to a guy in Algiers losing his job? If he doesn't work on an oil rig, why does he get fired?
Because the entire domestic economy is artificially propped up by state spending, which is, of course, funded by the oil.
Oh, okay.
So when oil is at, say, $100 a barrel, the state has billions of surplus dollars. It launches massive public works projects, building highways, new housing blocks, expanding universities.
Which creates a ton of jobs.
Millions of construction, logistics, and administrative jobs. The state also heavily subsidizes imported food and fuel, keeping the cost of living artificially low for everyone.
Okay, so the state is essentially the ultimate consumer and the ultimate employer.
Yes. But when oil drops to, say, $30 a barrel, state revenues plummet overnight. The government immediately has to pause the highway projects.
The money's gone.
The construction companies lose their contracts and lay off all their workers. Those workers stop spending money at local cafes and markets, so the service sector collapses.
It's a domino effect.
And simultaneously, the state can no longer afford the heavy subsidies on imported wheat or fuel, so the cost of basic goods skyrockets.
So we have a situation where people are losing their jobs at the exact same moment their groceries double in price.
It is a recipe for absolute disaster.
It means the nation is essentially driving down a treacherous mountain road in a car with absolutely no shock absorbers. If the global oil market hits a pothole, the citizens inside the car feel the crash instantly and violently.
The lack of shock absorbers is the defining vulnerability of a rentier economy. A diversified economy has shock absorbers.
Like other industries to fall back on.
Right. If one sector, like tech, takes a hit, the manufacturing or agricultural sectors can help stabilize the nation's GDP. But here, the data indicates there is no robust domestic manufacturing sector. There is no highly developed service industry or export market outside of hydrocarbons. There is nothing to break the fall.
So why not just build those shock absorbers? I mean, if the state has billions of dollars during the boom years, why don't they invest it in building non-oil industries? Why not build car factories or tech hubs so they aren't so dependent on the oil price?
That touches on a deeply complex economic phenomenon often referred to as Dutch disease, though we can understand it pretty simply through the lens of currency and incentives.
Okay, break that down for me.
When a country exports massive amounts of oil, foreign currency floods into the country. This artificially inflates the value of the local currency.
Making their money very strong.
Exactly. And because the local currency is so strong, it becomes incredibly cheap to just import everything from abroad. Cars, clothing, even food.
Hmm.
It's vastly cheaper to import it than to build factories and produce it domestically.
Oh, wow. So it's literally cheaper to buy a refrigerator from Europe than to manufacture one locally.
Exactly. Domestic manufacturing cannot compete with cheap imports. Furthermore, the oil sector is so lucrative that it sucks up all the available investment capital and the most skilled engineers.
Brain drain, but internally.
Yes. So while the state may want to diversify, the sheer gravitational pull of the oil wealth actively crushes the development of other industries. True, sustainable prosperity requires a diversified foundation. Without it, a nation's fate is completely out of its own hands.
It becomes a hostage to the geopolitical whims and market fluctuations of the rest of the world.
That's a very accurate way to put it.
Okay, so the state has this massive, highly volatile oil wealth, and it has this booming, urbanizing population that is living significantly longer. What did the government actually do with the money during those massive boom years?
They spent it.
Yeah, because looking through the sources, they didn't just hoard the cash in foreign bank accounts. They spent heavily on their citizens. Specifically, they built schools, a staggering number of them. But the results of this massive education drive are deeply, deeply contradictory.
They engineered what can only be described as an education revolution. But as the historical data consistently shows, revolutions, even well-intentioned ones, often have severe unintended consequences when they collide with an unyielding economic reality.
Let's track the literacy data. If you look at the stair-step climb in literacy rates and school enrollment over the decades, it is a triumphant trajectory.
It's incredible progress.
The largely illiterate society of the early post-independence era is gone. The state successfully mobilized resources to build schools in every province, mandate primary education, and push vast swaths of the population into universities.
They did exactly what modernization theory suggests they should do. They educated their youth.
But the data shows a massive glaring catch.
The divergence between education and employment.
Yes, there is a severe, almost painful divergence in the charts here. On one line, you have a highly educated, literate population climbing upward. On the other line, you have a soaring youth unemployment rate that refuses to drop.
It's a fundamental disconnect.
The state successfully produced highly literate, university-educated youth, but they simultaneously created a massive demographic of unemployed graduates. The sources actually describe this demographic as experiencing intense cognitive dissonance.
And cognitive dissonance is the perfect psychological term for this macroeconomic failure.
How so?
Consider the implicit social contract that the state offered these generations. Study hard, pass your exams, get your university degree, and you will be rewarded with a modern middle-class life.
Right, and the state aggressively fulfilled the first half of that bargain. They built the universities and handed out the degrees.
But the economy couldn't hold up the second half of the bargain.
Exactly.
Because as we just discussed, the economy is merely an echo of oil rents. It lacks internal complexity. A complex, diversified economy naturally generates a wide spectrum of white-collar jobs. In marketing, software development, domestic finance, advanced logistics, private sector research.
The whole ecosystem.
Right. But a rentier economy essentially only needs two types of workers: people to extract the oil and civil servants to help the government distribute the oil money.
So you have thousands of civil engineers, business administrators, and literature majors graduating every single year into an economy that has absolutely no use for them.
They graduate into a void. They were promised a modern life, but the structural limitations of the rentier economy make it impossible to deliver.
That's heartbreaking.
And this doesn't just create personal disappointment, it creates a profound systemic source of social instability. You have a highly articulate, digitally connected, and deeply frustrated youth demographic.
Because they know they've been shortchanged.
Exactly. They have the intellectual tools to analyze their own marginalization, and they feel, quite rightfully, that the system has broken its foundational promise to them.
And if you think that divergence is stark, wait until we look at the data on gender. This is one of the most jaw-dropping charts in the entire data set.
The mirror chart.
Yeah, it's presented as a mirror image graph. On the left side of the chart, you see total triumphant equality. Over the decades, female education levels have climbed relentlessly until they have perfectly converged with
How
men's.
lines touch.
Women in Algeria are just as educated, just as literate, and are passing university exams at the exact same, if not higher rates than men.
And by any metric of social development, achieving gender parity in higher education in just a few decades is a monumental achievement.
Right, but then you move your eyes to the right side of the chart.
Hmm.
This side tracks the labor force participation rate, and there is just a chasm.
A complete drop-off.
While female education matched men, female labor force participation remains staggeringly low. It is a flat line, scraping the bottom of the graph. So women are in the classrooms, but they're completely missing from the offices.
The researchers term this the education employment fracture.
I have to ask how this happens. I mean, I understand that Algeria has a traditional conservative culture,
Hmm.
but usually economic reality forces culture to adapt.
It usually does, yes.
In almost every other society that rapidly modernizes and educates its women, the sheer economic pressure of the modern world forces those women into the workforce. Two-income households become necessary just to survive. Why didn't that economic pressure break down the conservative social structures here? How does this roadblock persist?
You've hit on the exact mechanism of the paradox, and once again, the answer lies in the oil rents.
Really? How?
You are correct that in a normal transitioning economy, the rising cost of living necessitates dual-income households, which slowly erodes traditional patriarchal norms. But in a rentier state, the economic pressure is artificially neutralized.
Because of the subsidies.
Exactly. The state subsidizes housing, gasoline, electricity, water, and even staple foods. Because the state is artificially lowering the cost of living using oil money, a single-income household remains financially viable much longer than it would in a tax-based economy.
Wow. So the rentier state inadvertently bankrolls the survival of traditional household models. It removes the very economic stress that usually forces social evolution.
That is the precise mechanism. The state used oil money to build the schools and physically put girls in classrooms. They bought the infrastructure of equality.
But not the reality of it.
Right. Because the oil money also shields the population from harsh economic realities, the conservative culture never had to adapt to accommodate those educated women in the workforce.
So you end up with a massive pool of highly educated, capable women who are entirely invisible in the formal economy. Economically speaking, that is a catastrophic loss of human capital.
It's a massive drag on potential GDP.
The state invested billions of dollars to train half of its population, and then societal norms, subsidized by the state itself, prevent that investment from ever translating into economic productivity. You stall true modernization because half of your best-trained minds are kept on the sidelines.
It perfectly illustrates the limits of what money can achieve. You can buy school buildings and textbooks. You cannot buy social evolution.
Which leads us directly into the deepest, most complex layer of our sources. We've seen modern schools, we've seen modern medicine adding decades to life expectancy, and we've seen massive oil wealth. But when we look at the data on how this society is actually governed, the actual mechanics of the state institution's time seems to just stand still.
We enter what the report metaphorically and quite accurately calls the governance winter.
The governance winter. Let's talk about the radar chart here. For you listening, imagine a spiderweb chart, the kind you might see in a video game to track a character's stats. This chart measures different dimensions of governance.
Things like corruption control, legal stability, government effectiveness, and regulatory quality.
Right. And the researchers took the shape of the data from 1990, and they overlaid it directly on top of the shape of the data from 2020. 30 years of time, billions of dollars of oil wealth, and massive demographic shifts separate these two data points.
And the visual result is startling.
It's the exact same shape. The
Right.
radar chart shows almost zero expansion over 3 decades. The web hasn't grown. In fact, some dimensions, like legal stability, actually shrank slightly 50 years after independence.
It actually regressed.
It's as if the fundamental mechanisms of government were frozen in amber, completely insulated from the fact that the population quadrupled and the GDP skyrocketed.
There is a specific academic verdict in the report that synthesizes this failure perfectly. It states, the high-speed train of material modernization is carrying the snail of institutional modernization.
The snail of institutional modernization. That is a brutal assessment, but the data absolutely backs it up. However, I want to push back on this a bit, or at least point out an illusion in the data that could easily trick an outside observer.
Okay, what do you see?
Well, if you visited the country, or if you just looked at the technology metrics, you'd think this was a highly modernized, incredibly efficient state.
Ah, you're referring to the digital and infrastructure penetration.
Exactly. Look at the scatter plot tracking tech adoption. Between 2005 and 2015, electricity access hits nearly 100%. And the adoption of mobile phones, it's not even a curve. It's a vertical rocket ship climb straight up to total saturation.
It was incredibly fast.
If everyone has a smartphone connected to a 4G network and every home is wired to the grid, doesn't that require a highly effective government to execute? Isn't tech penetration a form of governance success?
It's a very common misconception, and it's crucial we clarify this illusion. Hardware is not governance.
Hardware is not governance. Okay.
What the data shows is the state's ability to liquidate natural resources to buy tech penetration. It is relatively easy for a centralized government to sign $1 billion check to foreign telecommunications contractors to erect cell towers across the country, especially when oil is sitting at $100 a barrel.
You just outsource the modernization.
Yes, but smartphones and power grids do not automatically generate government efficiency, bureaucratic transparency, or civil liberties. You can have a population with 100% 4G coverage who can instantly stream high-definition video, but who still have to pay a bribe to a local official to get a basic business permit.
Oh, wow.
You can have a fully electrified city where citizens still cannot trust the legal system to fairly enforce a commercial contract. Material tech penetration is a veneer. It masks the profound institutional stagnation underneath.
That brings up another really tricky metric that the researchers dissect, the Human Development Index, or HDI.
This is a critical point.
I'm looking at the bubble chart here, and Algeria's HDI is remarkably high. It's significantly higher than other countries that have similarly poor, stagnant governance levels. So I have to push back here on the narrative of failure. Isn't a high HDI inherently a massive win? It measures life expectancy, education, and per capita income.
True.
If kids are in school and people are living longer, why does it matter if the government bought it with oil money instead of taxes? A win is a win, right?
It matters deeply when we look at long-term survival, which is why the researchers dedicate so much time to deconstructing this specific statistical trap. You are correct that a high HDI reflects tangible benefits to the citizens, but there is a fundamental difference between an organic HDI and a bought HDI.
Explain the difference.
An organic HDI is achieved when a society builds a complex, productive economy. The citizens generate wealth, they pay taxes, and because they pay taxes, they demand that the government invest in high-quality schools and hospitals.
There's a feedback loop.
Exactly. The high HDI is a reflection of a functioning, accountable civil society. A bought HDI, which is what we see in a rentier state, bypasses the civil society entirely. The state extracts oil, sells it abroad, and uses the cash to massively subsidize healthcare and education.
So the outcome looks the same on paper, but the foundation is completely different.
Precisely. It is a reflection of how much oil was pumped, not how well the society is functioning institutionally. And the danger of a bought HDI is its extreme fragility.
Because it's tied to the oil price.
Because it isn't supported by a productive tax base, yes. The moment the oil revenue dries up, the state can no longer afford to fund the hospitals or the schools. The HDI isn't anchored to the society's actual capabilities. It's anchored to the global commodities market.
It's like having an incredible credit score and a luxurious lifestyle. Not because you have a successful career, but because you have a rich uncle who pays off your credit card bill every month.
A very apt mechanical analogy, actually.
And the moment the uncle goes broke, your entire lifestyle collapses because you don't actually know how to generate your own wealth.
Exactly. And if we look deeper into the economic data, specifically the Pareto chart, we see exactly who benefits most from this arrangement while the uncle is still rich.
Right, the income share chart. This is where the macroeconomic illusions really fall apart for me.
It reveals a lot.
The data shows the top 10% of the population holding a massive, sustained share of the national wealth over decades. While the overall GDP grew on paper, the Gini coefficient, which is the standard metric for measuring inequality, it shows that the working class felt completely left behind. If the state is handing out all these subsidies, why is the wealth still so heavily concentrated at the very top?
Because of how wealth flows in a rentier economy. In a diversified economy, wealth trickles up from thousands of different businesses and millions of workers. But in an oil-dependent state, the wealth enters the country through a single, tightly controlled spigot, the state-owned energy company.
The bottleneck.
Exactly. This inherently concentrates unimaginable financial power squarely in the hands of the system's core elites. the political, military, and bureaucratic figures who control that spigot.
So the elites control the source of the wealth, and they distribute just enough of it to the masses to keep them quiet.
Precisely. The general population receives the subsidies, the free education, the cheap gas, the basic clinics. But the actual accumulation of capital, the ability to invest globally, the control over massive state contracts, that remains locked at the very top of the hierarchy. Resource rent seeking guarantees extreme wealth concentration.
Okay, let's take a step back and look at the whole picture we've painted here, because it's a lot.
It is a complex web.
We have a rapidly growing youth population that is highly educated but chronically unemployed. We have women structurally sidelined from the economy. We have a volatile economy that crashes every time global oil prices dip. We have a deeply unequal distribution of wealth and a stagnant, rigid government bureaucracy. Any political scientist looking at those ingredients would predict an imminent revolution. How on earth has this political system survived so long? Why hasn't it collapsed or democratized like so many other nations over the last 60 years?
That leads us to the final and perhaps most sobering section of the data set, the superstability of the regime.
I am looking at the durability index in the sources right now. This metric tracks how long a political system remains fundamentally unchanged in its power structure. And the line is just stubbornly, impossibly high. But it's not completely flat. There's a very specific, incredibly turbulent dip in the data during the 1990s.
Yes. We cannot discuss Algeria's stability without addressing the 1990s, a period of severe civil strife often referred to as the Black Decade. And crucially, we have to look at the economic precursors that triggered it, because it perfectly validates everything we've discussed about the vulnerability of the rentier state.
Walk us through the mechanism of that collapse, because the data shows a massive oil price crash right before the violence starts.
In the mid-1980s, the global price of oil collapsed. Almost overnight, the Algerian state lost the vast majority of its revenue. Remember the shark absorbers we discussed?
We didn't exist.
They didn't exist.
Yeah.
The state suddenly could not afford the massive subsidies that kept the population pacified. They had to implement severe austerity measures. Food prices spiked, unemployment skyrocketed, and the implicit social contract was broken.
The uncle's credit card was declined.
Exactly. And without the oil money to buy social peace, the deep-seated frustrations of the youth, the unemployed, and marginalized groups exploded into massive protests. The state attempted a brief, chaotic opening of the political system, which quickly spiraled into a brutal, decade-long civil conflict.
So the drop in oil prices literally triggered a civil war. But what fascinates me is what happens after the 1990s.
The recovery phase.
Yeah, the regime doesn't collapse, and it doesn't fundamentally reform into a liberal democracy. The data shows that once global oil prices recovered in the 2000s, the system aggressively reverted right back to its long-term rigid baseline. It just rebuilt the exact same rentier apparatus.
While the rest of the world experienced various waves of democratization, the fall of the Berlin Wall, transitions across Latin America and Eastern Europe, this dataset shows a resilient system that learned how to use resource wealth to aggressively insulate itself from historical trends.
They literally bought their way out of democratization.
That is exactly what the data implies. Whenever social pressure builds up today, when those unemployed graduates start protesting in the capital, the regime's primary response is not to reform its institutions or increase political transparency. Its response is to open the checkbook.
They just throw money at the problem.
They announce billions in new housing subsidies. They create thousands of artificial administrative jobs in the public sector. They lower the price of cooking oil and bread. It buys stability.
But the report argues that this type of bought stability comes at a massive structural cost. By constantly buying its way out of trouble, the system sacrifices all social and political elasticity.
Elasticity is the key concept here. Think of a healthy, functioning democracy like a complex shock absorption system or a heavy-duty rubber band. It is inherently elastic. When new social movements arise or economic crises hit, the system stretches.
It adapts.
Yes, it accommodates new voices, it votes out failed leaders, it passes new laws to absorb the pressure, it bends.
But a rentier regime that relies entirely on subsidies doesn't have that elasticity.
No, it cannot bend. It relies entirely on control and distribution. It can only hold rigid. And as any structural engineer will tell you, a structure that is perfectly rigid is also perfectly brittle.
Right.
It might withstand incredible force for a long time, but if the pressure ever exceeds the absolute strength of the material, it doesn't bend to accommodate the weight. It catastrophically shatters.
And when we look at the predictive models at the very end of this data set, the researchers show us exactly what is going to apply that ultimate shattering pressure. It's not a foreign invasion, and it might not even be a sudden oil crash.
Sure.
It is the slow, ticking, undeniable clock of demographics. Let's explore the 2030 to 2050 outlook because the population periods in this report project a massive, unavoidable structural shift.
We are looking at the approach of the aging cliff.
Right now, as we discussed earlier, the median age in Algeria is quite young. That was the population dividend from the biological victory. But the projection models show this demographic reality moving aggressively toward an aging population by 2050.
The pyramid flips.
All those millions of young people from the 1990s and 2000s population booms are going to grow old. They are going to retire. And they're going to need pensions, chronic disease management, and advanced expensive health care.
The timing of this demographic shift represents a perfect storm. The era of having a massive young workforce whose needs can be temporarily met with basic housing subsidies and cheap fuel is ending. But that demographic dividend is ending at the exact historical moment that the global economy is aggressively trying to transition away from fossil fuels.
So as the world stops buying oil, or at least buys significantly less of it, Algeria's revenue will permanently drop.
Exactly. And concurrently, Algeria's own most accessible oil and natural gas reserves will begin to naturally deplete over the coming decades. The sheer volume of exports will shrink.
So the two foundational pillars of their entire 60-year survival strategy, a youthful population that requires relatively cheap maintenance and a supposedly endless stream of hydrocarbon revenue to pay for it, are both collapsing at the exact same time.
Which is why the academic warning at the conclusion of the report is so stark. A resource-driven rentier model fundamentally cannot survive this cliff. It is mathematically impossible.
So what do?
The state must make what economists call a thrilling leap to an innovation-driven, diversified economic model. They have to figure out how to build a productive economy, tax it fairly, and use those taxes to support the aging population before the oil runs out.
But here is the ultimate tragedy of the governance winter we discussed. To build an innovation economy, you need the exact institutions they failed to develop.
Precisely.
You need absolute legal stability so entrepreneurs feel safe investing their money. You need a transparent system with zero corruption so foreign capital will enter the market. You need empowered citizens who feel they have a stake in the system. And you absolutely need a labor force where your highly educated women actually participate and drive growth. You need the snail of institutional modernization to suddenly, miraculously transform into a high-speed train.
The regime spent 60 years buying stability instead of building capacity. If they fail to make that leap, if they cannot cultivate organic institutions, the resilient system will simply no longer have the cash required to buy its own rigidity. And that is the moment the perfectly brittle structure shatters.
So as we pull back and synthesize this massive 60-year data set, what does it all mean? How do we conceptualize this paradox of prosperity? The researchers leave us with a brilliant visual metaphor to summarize their findings. Imagine a set of classic brass balancing scales.
On the left tray of the scale, we pile up the undeniable, incredible material achievements of the last 60 years. We place the sheer weight of a quadrupled population. We add the miraculous biological victory of extending human life by 30 years. We pile on the near 100% infrastructure coverage of electricity grids and high-speed mobile networks. We add the total eradication of mass illiteracy and the achievement of gender parity in universities. It is a massive, heavy, deeply impressive tray.
But then, on the right tray, we have to place the glaring structural governance deficit. We put down the flatlined political freedoms. We add the rigid, stagnant government institutions that haven't evolved since the 1990s. We place the deep, systemic inequality driven by resource rent-seeking. We add the millions of invisible unemployed women and the complete lack of any internal non-oil industry capable of supporting the nation. When you step back and look at it, the scale is wildly, violently out of balance.
Which leads to the final, definitive academic verdict of the source report. Material modernization can be bought with cash, but governance modernization must be carefully cultivated. You cannot import the rule of law on a cargo ship, and you cannot build a vibrant civil society just by writing a check.
And that is exactly why this deep dive matters so much for you listening to this right now. We are constantly bombarded with global news, and it is incredibly easy to see a skyline full of shiny new infrastructure or hear a headline about a developing nation's skyrocketing GDP and immediately assume that the country has successfully modernized. But this data proves, definitively, that hardware is not software.
A very crucial distinction.
Having smartphones, Paved highways and heavily subsidized schools does not mean a society has actually evolved its civil rights or built resilient institutions. It forces all of us to ask what lies beneath the surface of a nation's wealth. Is that prosperity built on the deep, complex roots of a diverse, taxable economy, or is it just the fragile, temporary echo of the global commodities market?
We must always look past the material accumulation and rigorously question the structural foundation.
Exactly. I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, building on the closing sentiment of this massive report. The researchers note that data records the thickness of our history, but it warns us about the breadth of our future. We've spent this time analyzing Algeria's specific developmental paradox. But it makes you wonder, as the global push for green energy accelerates and Western nations rapidly scale down their reliance on fossil fuels to meet climate goals, is Algeria just the canary in the coal mine? How many other seemingly wealthy, stable regimes around the world are secretly standing on the exact same demographic and economic trapdoor, waiting for the day the oil checks inevitably bounce?